Hi, Professor. My name is Ajvala, and my presentation is going to be on Microsoft and its offshore cash holdings. And first of all, I want to thank you for your time and everything that we've learned all semester. And if you have any questions at the end of my presentation, please do email me or contact me in any way. I'm happy to help resolve. So, beginning my presentation, the core components of my presentation will be focused on the strategic benefits, the international tax law. Will just briefly talk about how is Microsoft and many other companies able to even hold international cash assets, and we'll also talk about the benefits and the opportunity cost of this law and taking advantage of it, and the ethical standpoint of is it actually ethical for companies to be taking advantage of the U.S. tax law to hold offshore cash. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, to begin my presentation, I'd like to start with a very famous quote by author Leon Megginson, and he says, "It is not the strongest or the most intelligent business who will survive, but those who can best manage change." And I think that is a great quote and summation of a lot of things that we've learned this semester, right, with international business and multinational operations, is that with globalization, with technology, with all the resources available globally, really globally, these things are changing. And it's not only changing the way consumers are purchasing products and services, but it's changing the way businesses must adapt to increase profitability, reduce their costs, and really be sustainable in this new world. So I think that quote really best surmises where my point of view is on this case. Because as an introduction, 2011, Microsoft was able to purchase the communication platform Skype for $8.5 billion. Now, they did this using offshore cash assets, which we'll go into in a little bit. But what I'd like to really highlight is that the benefit of this acquisition truly does outweigh the potential ethical and opportunity cost of using the offshore cash assets, because Microsoft, like many other companies, did what they had to do and currently do to survive and adapt to this change so they can be more sustainable and keep managing their growth in a very competitive sector. So let me explain a little bit more into the background of the case. Now, Skype presented a very, I would say, interesting acquisition target for Microsoft in three major ways, three major benefits. Now, Microsoft currently has, and had at 2011, they had two communication platforms. They had Microsoft Live and Microsoft Lync. Now, Lync was the enterprise software used for all the organizations to do internal communications, and Microsoft Live was a messenger which was utilized by everyone, people on computers, people on Xboxes, other Microsoft platforms and products. They were using Microsoft Live Messenger. Now, the thing with Microsoft Live was that it's a free messenger, so Microsoft wasn't actually able to take any profits from that. And users, after multiple surveys, users had no intentions of ever paying for Microsoft Live as well. Now, in comes Skype. Skype had one major interesting point, which was a lot of its users, though they were smaller, they were paying for the service. So that in itself was one of the benefits that Microsoft saw in Skype, that, hey, here's a communication platform that is actually being able to charge its users for its service. So point number one, benefit of purchasing of this acquisition was, here's a paid platform that its users and marketing have all been ingrained. Now, strategic benefit number two was Skype had voice over IP software, which is calling over the internet internationally. Now, this is a game-changing software in itself. Now, why did Microsoft want to acquire Skype? Is because they had a mobile market. Microsoft creates phones, as we all know, and they create the Android devices. Now, within that, they wanted to integrate a voice over IP software so they can even gain a bigger market share. So Skype had that great functionality which was already mobile compatible. But now, it can be argued that Microsoft could have built this voice over IP software in-house, and it could have been cheaper than $8.5 billion. But paired with the advantage of having a paid user base, Microsoft was able to justify the purchase. But now, the third major benefit which is extremely key that I really want to focus on, is Facebook and Google also have communication platforms. I believe they have Google Chat, and Facebook has Messenger. Now, both of those communication platforms are also free. So, as a competitive advantage, Microsoft almost had to make the purchase of Skype in order to keep it out of the hands of their competitors. So, these are major benefits that I think we did hear about in the case by Charles Hill. But I think that these are benefits the shareholders will reap, and I'll come back to this point, but something to really focus on. Now, as a background, I'd like to just very briefly talk about the U.S. tax and just give you the facts that it is one of the highest in the world, at about 35% maximum. Now, it has fluctuated with the Trump tax law going down to even 20%, but we are still seeing that the U.S. tax law is generally the highest. So, many companies and corporations, this is technological corporations, pharmaceuticals, they are really benefiting by going to these offshore areas because the tax law is lower. So they're able to keep more of their profits. So as a key point to keep in mind, as a multinational corporation, they're able to reap the benefits of being affiliated with different pieces of the world so they can take advantage of the tax. So we'll get more into it, but I just want to really emphasize that Microsoft is not alone in holding offshore assets. I mean, we can look at the graph on the page here, and we see that organizations like Johnson & Johnson, they're holding 100% of their cash offshore. Oracle, Pfizer, all these pharmaceuticals. Now even Google is doing about 48% offshore. Microsoft, Apple, General Electric, Cisco, a lot of the percentage of money is held offshore. Why? Because of these assets, of these tax benefits. So I really want to highlight this because it goes back to the first quote that I mentioned by Leon Magnuson, which is, with change, everyone needs to adapt. Now, if your competitors are taking advantage of these tax benefits, you have to stay competitive and be as profitable as them. You have to kind of keep up with the punches and the changes. So, I think the ethical benefits outweigh the unethical compromises for this reason, because it is business at the end of the day. Now, let's dive into one of the key questions that we have within this case study. Now, the case study says, the question is, what were the benefits to Microsoft shareholders of using cash held overseas to purchase Skype? Now, the benefits, as we listed out, if Microsoft kept the cash outside of US, they were able to take advantage of a ex-US tax rate, which is about 4%. Versus, if they brought that cash back to the US, they would be facing about 30 to 35% more on tax penalties. So one of the biggest benefits for the shareholders, now what is a shareholder, right? We must also understand what is the definition of a shareholder. A shareholder's major intention, a good shareholder, is the growth of the company. Now, a large part of Microsoft's research and development is occurring in the US. However, their products and services are being sold using their affiliate organizations outside of the US. So, as a shareholder, the biggest benefit they got was they reaped the 3 strategic benefits which we just outlined by purchasing Skype. But in addition, they were able to use offshore cash assets, which they weren't otherwise going to be bringing into the US anyway. So might as well take those cash savings that are sitting out there, and invest more in research and development to grow the overall business and its competitive advantage, right? Because at the end of the day, a shareholder really wants Microsoft to win. They don't want anyone else to win. So the long-term sustainability is a major benefit. I just want to again emphasize that if they had brought the cash back to the U.S., they would be paying major tax penalties, which would literally make no sense to do. So the second question in the key analysis is, Microsoft's effective tax rate on foreign earnings retained overseas appears to be only 4%. How is this possible given the corporate tax rate in most developed countries where Microsoft earns profits from foreign sales are considerably higher? Now, after this slide, I'll go into a quick example of a real-world example, but I just want to briefly discuss a point which I learned about from the 2012 publication by the United States Committee on Homeland Security, and they talk about transfer pricing. Excuse me. They talk about complex transfer pricing. Now, transfer pricing at a high level is multinational organizations there's about four or five ways that transfer pricing can work. But essentially, how it's listed in the Senate is that given a multinational, let's say we're in the U.S., we can have subsidiary or affiliate organizations within our company, but these organizations must have a certain agreement, a licensing share agreement, a royalty share agreement, intellectual property ownership, something that allows them to essentially own that product. Now, why is this important? Because Microsoft, now specifically let's talk about Microsoft. Microsoft sold the intellectual property rights for its retail assets, so the sale profits get funneled directly to these tax havens, which we are referring to as only appearing to be 4%. So these tax havens are where the tax rate is much lower, also called tax shelters. So I really want to emphasize that the reason why this is occurring is because Microsoft has broken up its intellectual property rights to these other organizations, other subsidiary overseas organizations, and as such, the money is going. Although the sale is happening in the U.S. or any other place, UK, the money is still going to the ownered company, which is, let's say, in Puerto Rico, which is 4% tax. So that's what's so interesting. So this is actually a loophole, so to speak, within the United States tax law. However, I don't see it's going anywhere anytime soon because these organizations, which I'll go more into in my presentation and my paper, are really supporting the economic development, the intellectual development, the general growth of our economy and world. So I think if the government is realizing these complex structures are occurring, but these companies are still doing good in the world, so they're allowing it to happen. Now, again, I'd like to give a real-world example here for to kind of bring this down to our level. If I go to Manhattan right now, if I go to the Microsoft store on the left side in Manhattan on Fifth Avenue, and I go purchase, let's say, Microsoft Windows, right? Purchase the product, the software, Microsoft Windows, the CD. That sale, very interestingly enough, the money will go to Microsoft in Puerto Rico because this is the key. Microsoft Puerto Rico owns the intellectual property of the Windows software, but not only that, they manufactured the software and they shipped it from Puerto Rico to Manhattan. So the sale eventually goes to Puerto Rico and they pay the Puerto Rican tax, which is 4%, as we mentioned. That's a real world example. Now, key analysis question number 3. Why does Microsoft continue to hold so much cash overseas rather than returning it to the United States? What do you think the opportunity cost of holding tens of billions of dollars in cash in foreign locations? What potential benefits might accrue to Microsoft shareholders if it returns some of that cash to the United States? So let's break this down. Why does Microsoft continue to hold the cash overseas? Well, of course, as we mentioned, if they bring back that money or repatriate it, they would be paying the U.S. tax fines, which can take a 4% taxed initially asset and make it into a bracket of 30 to 35%. So they would be paying so much more in billions of dollars just to bring that money back to the U.S. So for them, it literally makes sense to keep it in these tax havens and shelters. What are the opportunity costs? Now, I'd like to reiterate one of the points I brought up before. Is the opportunity cost is that as a U.S. shareholder, if I know that a company is keeping a lot of its assets in foreign organizations, I would not be able to reap the dividends from that stock, right? That share that I hold, because they're not showing it. The revenue is being shown in a different organization, not in the U.S. So I would not be able to hold the dividends. So I wouldn't be getting these quick cash bonuses for holding that share. However, I do want to say that opportunity cost, and that could also potentially even deter people to go to other shares, right? Rather than purchasing a share of Microsoft, which is holding 90% of its cash offshore, maybe I'll purchase Apple, which is holding about 48% of its cash offshore. So theoretically, yes, it can. The opportunity cost is that shareholders will be deterred. However, I do want to highlight that if the benefit, of course, to the shareholders, the third part of the question is if this money comes back to the United States, yes, it would be returned. Some of it would be returned to the shareholders through a dividend. So that's the question. But I do want to point out that although we have this opportunity cost of shareholders, I do want to point out that there's two differences between a short-term shareholder and a long-term shareholder. A short-term shareholder is looking for quick dividends, quick profits. A long-term shareholder realizes that a company's true value is in its R&D in game-changing products and services, right? So, as a long-term shareholder, I would not be deterred by understanding that Microsoft, like many organizations, are holding cash offshore because I realize that they'll be able to better focus their profitability in R&D in the US and then creating those game-changing products that will make sure that that company is there for the long haul and I can invest my retirement, my 401, everything in them because they're going to be around for the long term. That's what I really care about as a long-term shareholder versus a short-term shareholder doesn't care about that. Key question number 4. Do you think it is ethical for companies like Microsoft to continue to hold cash overseas in order to avoid paying U.S. corporate income tax? Is this practice always the best in the interest? Now, as we mentioned, there are opportunity costs for short-term shareholders in that they're not able to take a lot of those cash assets. However, I will say this. I think it is ethical. In business, it is ethical to do what will create the most profit and stay true to your purpose. Microsoft's purpose isn't to pay the most tax to the US government. If that's their purpose, then great. Then it would be unethical for them to do this. But their purpose isn't to do that. Their purpose is to create game-changing, life-changing software for the world. Now, if that's their purpose, then yes, it is ethical for them to figure out how can they best put themselves in a financial position in this case to accomplish that purpose. So it is ethical for them because they have come out and said they are a for-profit company and their purpose is to create life-changing, game-changing software and services. So in order to do that, just like many other organizations, they are holding offshore cash assets overseas. So I think, again, it goes back to that first quote in my argument that by Leon Magnuson, that in order to adapt to the world, we must change in order to survive. So they are focusing all of their profits by all these cash savings offshore and funneling them into the important R&D that Microsoft does for our world. Now, at this point, I'd like to point out that a lot of people do oversee this because we take it so much for common, right? That Microsoft has given us so much. Bill Gates and his partner have really created so much hardware, software, innovation. They've inspired millions to create more software, to create more technology. They're working on holographic technology. They're working on more communication globally. They're working on security platforms that are utilized by governments, banks, economies. I mean, you name it. The military, everyone's using Microsoft to some degree. So we cannot underestimate that their contributions are significantly ethically supporting our world. So if it takes questionable methods of holding offshore money to fund their ethical contributions, I think it's okay. Now, in conclusion, in 2011, Microsoft strategically purchased Skype in order to obtain their voice over IP, to bolster their mobile platform, and really make sure that their competitors do not take advantage of it. Now, they did this wisely by using their offshore cash assets of $8.5 billion. These cash assets, as I'd like to emphasize again, would not have been brought back to the US because it's just too expensive. They would have paid a very high tax rate. So, although Microsoft used these offshore tax assets, I think it was very ethical that they did so because they were still perpetrating their mission of growing the overall sustainability of the company by acquiring a communication platform like Skype. Short-term shareholders would be affected by this because they're not able to reap the quick dividends and cash incentives. However, long-term investors who are concerned with the overall sustainability and the innovation of the company would be benefiting because they are acquiring using an offshore cash asset, which they wouldn't have probably seen that money anyway, and now to grow the overall organization, right? It's better to have 1% of a big pie than 10% of a little pie. Overall, I think this is the most ethical decision that Microsoft could have made in purchasing Skype using offshore cash accounts. And they're really, again, bolstering our overall communication in our world, and I really support Microsoft in this. I just want to conclude my presentation by thanking you, Professor Kim, and if you have any questions, please let me know. And for references, please check out the last slide, which I have detailed of where I have gained my own inspiration, and of course our class slides. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.